Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. We are doing part 2 of routing. This is your host, ID Jester, and we're talking about the Advanced Squad Leader rules set. Hopefully you've been able to watch part 1 because we're going to take the rules we learned in part 1 and we're going to expand them and add some more rules and then show you some more examples. I am going to go over these rules rather quickly because I tend to find that going over the basic rules, then showing an example, and then kind of talking about these rules makes you, when you reread the rule, understand it a lot better than me spending a lot of time reading the rules. So things we're going to talk about right now are low crawl. A low crawl is a route of one location which requires your entire movement factor allowance of your routing unit, which can be good in some situations where you don't want to route a whole bunch of spaces away from the enemy. You think you can bring this unit back rather quickly. It might not fall in enemy hands, and you don't want to route away a whole bunch of hexes. You can low crawl, and the other advantage of low crawling is routing unit using low crawl cannot be interdicted. All other route provisions apply unchanged, and it still must be towards the nearest building or wood hex within 6 movement factors. A routing unit which enters a open ground hex without low crawling in both the line of sight and normal range of an unbroken enemy unit capable of fire with at least 1 firepower without any form of line of sight hindrance is subject to a normal morale check and everything that applies to that, which means if you fail your interdiction normal morale check, you're going to suffer casualty reduction. You can also, interdicting units are subject to be pinned. And if you're pinned while still adjacent to a known armed enemy unit, you will be eliminated for failure to rout. Interdictors 10.532. One unit may interdict any number of routing units. It may interdict the same routing unit in more than one hex. Similarly, CX and encircled units, units using spotted fire, one in melee cannot interdict. If a gun has to change its covering arc, or has a positive die roll modifier that is disallowed, it can't interdict. If it has a vehicle has to change its vehicle covering arc or its turret covering arc, it is also unable to interdict. A leader has without a support weapon has no range and therefore cannot interdict. And a unit whose firepower is halved because of pinning, motion, mounted fire, etc. may not interdict. And of course, anything that is going to be interdicting must be functioning at the time. We have not talked about concealment. In fact, we'll probably have an episode or 2 specifically on concealment because it's such a big and important part of the advanced squad leader rules. But I want you to be aware of it. So 10.533, concealed units, since they are not known, must be ignored by the routing player in determining its legal route path. The presence of a concealed enemy unit in the closest building or woods hex to a unit that must route does not free the broken unit from its normal obligation to route to that hex. Upon entrance of the concealed unit's location, one concealed non-dummy unit becomes known and repulses the routing unit into the last occupied hex, where the routing unit must end its route phase and be eliminated for failure to route. A concealed unit can possibly claim interdiction or force a routing unit to alter its route by becoming known. Therefore, it loses its concealment during the route phase while in the line of sight of the routing unit. And a couple other spare rules we need to look at really quickly that maybe I glossed over. Units do not have to take the shortest path to the destination hex, and units can carry up to its inherent portage capacity in support weapons, but must drop anything in excess. Well, we're going to try to look at all these and give some examples out here in our Vassal module and then kind of explain what we're talking about. So you can see I have a whole bunch of counters on the Vassal map, and as we go over each of these different examples, I want you to disregard all the other counters on the map when we're talking about them. So in this first example, we're only going to deal with these 4 counters here, so disregard all other counters again on the map as we talk about what's going on. We can see that it is the Axis player, the German player's turn. It is now the rout phase. So the attacker must route his units first. In this case, that would be the German player. So the German player has a unit in G7. It is broken. It has a DM counter, so it can route. And if we look at G7, if we remove the counters, we can see that G7 is in fact an open hex. So in fact, this unit must route. There is no option. It must route away. So we have just learned that there's basically going to be two different kind of routes. The first route is where you're going to be using your movement factors to route away, and the second kind of route is basically a low crawl where you're going to move into a adjacent location towards your destination hex. We can see that we have a couple American units up here in F4 and I3. Bad news for the German player though. In H9 there is a concealed unit here, so he has to disregard this unit is actually here. And the German player will then decide where he is nearest wood or building hex. You can see that D6 is 1, 2, 3, 4 movement factors away. G9 is 1, 2, 3. So the nearest woods or building hex that he can get to is G9. So this would be his route destination. So he must either low crawl towards that destination or he must move towards that destination, being able to enter into that by the end of his route by abiding by all of the route rules. Well, the German player, he knows that if he low crawls, he's going to end up going into G8, and that will be the end of his phase right there. He also knows that if he ends up going into G9, the American player can also remove his concealment counter, and at that point, this unit would become known. And since he's adjacent to a known enemy unit, he would have to leave that hex and try to route away farther. So let's assume the German player decides to route into G9 because low crawling into G8 is not basically going to get him anywhere. So he's going to go ahead and choose G9 as his designation. Let's just assume he decides to low crawl. In this case, he low crawls into that hex. He has completed his route and he's done routing. That's as simple as it gets. Before he decides to do this, though, the American player could lose his concealment and say, okay, I've got a unit there. In this case, the German player cannot route down to this hex here because it would be getting closer to a known enemy unit, 1, 2, 3, and he would move 1, 2 spaces away from it. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, yep, okay, 1, 2. So if the American player decided to lose concealment on this unit before the German player routed, this unit could not move here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. At that point, the German player could then choose D6 as his closest destination hex for his route, and he could choose to route into F7. At this point, he would not be interdicted. If he chose to go into E7 and then into D6, so that would be 1, 2, 3. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm valid in my move there. So he didn't move any closer. He stayed 3 hexes away, 3 hexes away. So he is good here when he was here. Let me make sure he didn't. So he's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yep. So this is a valid route into F7, E7, and D6, which is actually a good move for him. Because he gets away from the enemy units, he's not getting encircled and everything else. Let's take the same example. This time the American player decides not to do anything. The German player decides to move into a route into G8 for 1 movement factor, and then into G9 for 2 more movement factors for a total of 3. At this point, the American player says, "Aha! I will show you that I've got a unit in that hex. You must run away from me." So the German player cannot stay adjacent to a known enemy unit, so it must route away. It cannot move into F8 because in doing so it would become getting closer to a known enemy unit. 1, 2, 3. Let's make sure 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's 5 hexes away here. If he moves into this hex, he'll be 4 spaces away. So he can't move into F8. So he has to move into F9 to get away. So the first thing he must determine is where he cannot at this point, also, it should be noted, he cannot then decide to low crawl away because he's already spent some movement factors to get there. And remember, to low crawl, you need to use all of your movement factors. So he would have to spend a movement factor to move into this hex. At that point, the American is within normal range and line of sight and has no hindrances to him. So in this case, the American player is going to be interdicted, and he is going to take a normal morale check. You can see on the back of his counter, a normal morale check is a 7. If we roll some dice here and roll, he rolls a 2 and a 1, so nothing happens. It should be noted that when you do an interdiction check, there's actually no attack roll made. It's just the defender must make a normal morale check. It's just assumed that these guys are shooting you as you're running away. At that point, the American has spent a total of 1, 2, 3, 4 movement factors. He could then spend another 1.5 movement factors to move into that hex, and he would end, or actually probably even better would be probably to move into that hex. Or maybe not. Maybe this hex might be better. Either way, he would finish his route because he had spent 5.5 movement factors of his 6 movement factors, and he followed the rules about what he could do. Next example we're going to go over is just these 4 counters again. In these rows of P, Q, and R, so again, disregard everything else. So the German player must route his broken unit in P4. You can see that it has a leader in that hex, and several interesting things that we need to talk about in this route example. The American player can actually not get anywhere if we're just assuming that these 2 units are the only units, plus this one down here, which is not a known enemy unit because he has no line of sight to it. So he can't, this is not known to him. This is known and this is known. So based on that information, if he tries to figure out his closest building in wood hex, which is going to be P8 actually, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 movement factors away. Well, the German player kind of feels lucky in this situation because first of all, he's going to have a unit to route, and he has a leader that can route with that unit. So that's pretty good for him, he's thinking. And the other benefit is because of these grain hexes in P3, Q4, and R4, the units in P2 and R3 can't interdict him. So in a normal situation, he would be able to move into that into that clear hex and not have to make a morale check because these guys have line of sight hindrance to the enemy unit. And if you remember our talk from last time when we were talking about an open ground hex, it's going to be a hypothetical defensive first fire where you can apply a -1 FFMO, move in the open, die roll. In this case, you can't apply that die roll modifier because of the line of sight hindrances, and so the German player can move there into that hex without having to take interdiction. So he spent 1 movement factor to move there, a 2nd movement factor to move there, a 3rd movement factor, and again, the leader can route with the unit even though it's not broken. And that's the only unit that can move, and it's the only unit that can route when it's not under DM counter. So he spent a total of 1 movement factor, 2 movement factors, 3 movement factors, 4 or 5 movement factors, but he enters this hex, and this is now a known enemy unit. He knows this is a known enemy unit, so he cannot stay adjacent to a known enemy unit, so he has to get out of there. If this was, for example, his last routing movement factor, if entering P8 was his last routing movement factor, if that was his 6th movement factor, he would have to end his route there, and he would be adjacent to a known enemy unit. In that case, he would be eliminated for failure to route. In this case, he had spent 5 movement factors to get to that hex, so he has to remove himself from that hex. And the only hex that's valid for him to get away would be this hex. When he moves into this hex, he's going to take a normal morale check from this unit here that has line of sight and in its normal range and doesn't have any line of sight hindrance. So at this point, the German player would have to make a normal morale check for that unit. He rolls a 4 and a 4, which is 8, 8 is his morale, so at that point, this unit would become pinned and he would get a pin counter. All right, let's go back and show this example again and talk about something else here. Let's say, for example, this unit started his route phase here instead of in P4. In this case, the American player doesn't have to choose P8 as its designation hex because the closest actual unit space is going to be either O1 or N0 or O1. Wow, that's tough to say. And he can choose these as his destination route hex because it would cost him 1.5, 3, 4, 5, 6 movement factors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they're equal distance away. He can choose to use either one of these hexes. In this case, we talked about it doesn't have to take the shortest path to his destination hex. So if he wanted to go the shortest path, obviously it'd be O3, O2, O1. But he chooses to go into N3, which is good for him because he can't be interdicted. Again, N2, and he goes into N1. He will be interdicted in that hex, and then he can move either into that hex or this hex. So that kind of gives him, shows you that you don't need to necessarily take the straightest path, and that's all the example I'm trying to show you in this case. But you can actually spend more movement factors than you need to get, but you must be able to arrive in your destination hex. If we take this unit back here for a second, and this unit was here, as opposed to over there, this just German broken unit is then in a world of hurt. Because if it had to route down to P8, or chose to route to P8, it would take a normal morale check there, it would take a normal morale check here, and it would take a normal morale check here, all from this single unit here. So the single unit can alter, and again, that interdiction attack is not an actual die roll, it's just automatic. You have to make a morale check. So if this unit was here in this position as opposed to up here in R3, it would be much better for the American player because the German player would then have to be interdicted. Of course, his other choice, instead of being interdicted, and probably a better choice for the German player at this point in this situation, would be to low crawl his guys into O4 and get away, spend all of his movement factors to get into O4. At least he's got a little bit of cover there. Might not help him in that situation, but it's better than trying to run all the way down to P8 and be interdicted as he goes and having to take a lot of normal morale checks. So again, that's another situation where low crawl might come into play, and it might be more advantageous for you to do. Lastly, just so everybody knows, for example, if this unit here had, if we look at it, if this unit here had this heavy machine gun, you notice it has 4 PP on it. That's its portage point. A squad has an inherent portage capacity of 3. So at this point, actually, what I was going to do was put both of these guys on there. Whoops. Let's do that. Let's talk about that really quickly, maybe, if I can get that lined up. All right. So this squad originally had a heavy machine gun and a light machine gun with it. It obviously can't carry all that stuff when it goes to route. Whether it's low crawling or not, doesn't matter. At that point, he's going to take whatever is up to and including his portage capacity, the biggest weapon he can that's not over his portage capacity. This unit here is a 4 portage points. This is a 1 portage point, so he can't carry all of it because he doesn't want to be slowed down by the big heavy machine gun. So he's going to leave that behind, and he's going to low crawl, into one more time, into O4. Again, I'm not specifically talking about support weapons at this point. We'll get into that later on in further episodes. I'm just showing you an example of if you have weapons with your broken units and they're routing away, they're not going to carry around all the big heavy weapons. I kind of just glossed over that last time, but I wanted to at least introduce it this time just to show you some examples. So this is part 2 of routing. Again, pretty comprehensive. There's a lot going on, lots of different nuances that you have to understand about routing. And next time, hopefully, we'll finally get to look at our big example and give you some little face-to-face thought processes of how the different routes happen, what the different rules are, and hopefully cover routing so we can be finished with it and move on to some more and different rules for the advanced squad leader system. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it. And if you have any thoughts or comments, please leave them below.